Nobody holds a gun to your head in a situation like this. That's the part people don't understand when you try to explain it later. There's no villain with a plan, no dramatic moment where you realize you're being taken. There's just a household that grows one person at a time. A wife whose face does a very specific thing when you hesitate, and a man who tells himself every month that this is family, this is love, this is what you signed up for. By the time Philip Kowalski figured out what he'd actually signed up for, he was feeding 14 people on a pension built for one. This is how it happens when nobody asks for anything, and everything disappears anyway. The motorcycle was a Honda Click, $1,400. That's what ended it. Not the $180,000, not the 5 years, not the 14 people eating 3 meals a day in a compound I'd paid to expand twice with my own retirement savings. A $1,400 motorcycle for Salvina's brother Raul is what finally made me say the word no out loud, and within a week of saying it, I understood exactly what I was to that family and what I had always been. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the beginning, because the beginning was genuinely good, and I want to be fair about that. If it had all been bad from the start, I'd have left in the first month. The reason I stayed 5 years is because the beginning was real. At least, it felt real. And at 61 years old, after 32 years on a factory floor, and a marriage that had quietly died somewhere around year 20, and a retirement that turned out to be lonelier than I'd planned for, something feeling real was enough. I'd spent 32 years as a supervisor at the Lordstown Assembly Plant outside Cleveland, Ohio. General Motors. We built Chevrolets. I knew every inch of that floor and every face on my crew, and I was good at my job in the specific way that factory work rewards. Consistent, reliable, fair, the kind of supervisor people didn't complain about to HR. When the plant went through its restructuring, and the buyout package came across my desk at 59, I took it. My wife Carol and I had divorced 6 years before that, 2 years after our son Derek went off to college in Columbus, and the house got quiet in a way we hadn't been prepared for. The divorce was clean enough. Derek spent holidays with both of us. Carol got the house in Parma, and I rented an apartment near the lake that I told myself I preferred. By the time the buyout came, I had $340,000 in retirement savings, a monthly pension of $2,400, Social Security that would kick in at 62, and no particular plan for any of it. I had a lake view I didn't look at, and a kitchen I didn't cook in, and a son who called on Sundays, and a life that had all the correct elements in approximately the wrong proportions. My buddy Walt, who'd retired 2 years earlier from the plant and moved to Arizona, told me about the Philippines over the phone one night. Walt wasn't a complicated man, and he didn't complicate his description. He said the weather was warm, the cost of living was low, the food was good, and the people were friendly. He said he knew 3 guys who'd retired there, and none of them regretted it. He said I should just go look. I went to Iloilo City in January, of what I'll call year 0. A 2-week trip, nothing committed, just a look, the way Walt described it. I stayed in a mid-range hotel near the Esplanade, ate at local restaurants, walked the streets in the early morning, when it was still cool, and felt the particular sensation of being somewhere that had no file on me. Nobody in Iloilo knew about the plant, or the divorce, or the apartment near the lake. I was just an American on holiday, which was a simpler identity than I'd had in years. I met Salvina on the 9th day. Not at a bar, not through an app, not at any of the places you hear about in cautionary stories. I met her at a family-style restaurant near the old downtown where I'd been eating lunch 3 days in a row because the chicken adobo was the best I'd ever had. She was eating alone at the next table, reading something on her phone, and she knocked over her water glass, and I helped mop it up with a fistful of napkins, and we both laughed about it, and she said thank you, and I said no problem, and then we ended up talking for an hour because neither of us had anywhere specific to be. She was 30 then. She worked, she told me, as an administrative assistant at a medical clinic downtown. She had a quiet self-possession about her that I found immediately attractive. Not showy, not aggressive, just settled. She asked questions and listened to the answers, which sounds like a basic human behavior, but I want to tell you that in a long enough period of solitude, A person who listens to you can feel like water in a drought. We exchanged numbers before I left the restaurant. I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just one of those travel conversations that stays pleasant, because it doesn't have to become anything. She texted me that evening to say it was nice to meet me. I texted back. We met for coffee the following afternoon, then dinner 2 nights later. On my last evening in Iloilo, she came to walk along the esplanade with me, and we stood at the railing watching the lights on the water, and she said, very simply, "I hope you come back." I went home to Cleveland and thought about it for 6 weeks, and then booked another trip. I won't narrate every visit. There were 4 more over the following 18 months, each one longer than the last. What I'll say is that Salvina was consistent in a way that mattered to me. She was the same person every time. She didn't perform differently when things were good versus when they were difficult. And there were difficult moments. Ordinary relationship difficult. The kind you navigate together rather than around. She told me about her family in a way that felt honest. Her mother was a widow. Her older brother Raul had been working construction in Manila, but the work was inconsistent. She had a younger sister who was finishing nursing school. She wasn't hiding any of this. She wasn't dramatizing it either. She was just describing her life in the way that people describe their lives when they trust you. I proposed at the end of my 4th visit. I know that the speed of this will raise eyebrows, and I understand why. But I want you to understand that 2 years of regular visits and daily phone calls and genuine conversation is not nothing. I was not a man who had known her for 3 weeks and fallen for a stranger. I was a man who had taken it slow and talked about real things and made a considered decision. I married Salvina Balagtas at a civil ceremony in Iloilo in March of year 2. Her mother, Nena, attended. Her brother Raul attended. Her sister Lovely was finishing exams and couldn't be there, which Salvina mentioned twice with a sadness that I noticed, but didn't think too much about. I had Derek on a video call from Columbus during the ceremony, which was his compromise between wanting to support me and not being sure enough about the whole situation to fly to the Philippines. He said congratulations, and I could see in his face that he was reserving judgment, which I respected. We had a small reception dinner at a restaurant afterward, 8 people. Nina sat across from me and smiled and said, "You will take care of my Salvina," and I said yes, of course, and she patted my hand and went back to her food. I thought it was a sweet maternal moment. I have thought about that sentence many times since. We moved into a house I'd rented in a residential area south of the city. A solid concrete house, 3 bedrooms, a small garden, a covered carport. The rent was $650 a month, which felt very reasonable by Cleveland standards. Salvina had already set it up beautifully before I arrived. Curtains, proper bedding, a kitchen that worked, a small table on the porch where we had coffee every morning. Those first 6 weeks were genuinely happy. I'll say that clearly. The coffee on the porch, the morning sounds of the neighborhood, Salvina cooking dinner and us eating together and talking about nothing consequential. That was real. Whatever came after it, those 6 weeks were real. Nena arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the wedding. A short visit, Salvina said. Her mother wanted to spend some time with us and see the new house. Of course, that was completely reasonable. I set up the 2nd bedroom. Nena brought 2 large bags and a box of kitchen equipment and a framed photograph of the Virgin Mary that she hung in the hallway on her 2nd day, but I didn't read anything into any of that. Mother's visit. That's what they do. 8 weeks later, Nana was still there. When I mentioned, gently, that it had been a while, Salvina said her mother wasn't comfortable alone in the family home in the province, and that it was only a little longer, just until things settled. I asked what things. Salvina said her mother's health wasn't great, and she worried about her on her own. I said I understood. I did understand. Her father was gone, and her mother was getting older, and I wasn't going to be the man who sent a widowed mother-in-law home, because the visit had gone over schedule. Raul arrived in month 4. He'd lost his construction contract in Manila, Salvina told me. The project had been canceled, the company had let the crew go, and he needed somewhere to stay while he looked for new work. Just temporarily. Of course. He moved into the 3rd bedroom. Raul was 36, and not unpleasant company. He was helpful around the house in a practical way. He fixed the gate latch I'd been meaning to fix. He painted the carport. He drove Nena to her doctor's appointments on the scooter he'd brought from Manila. I found myself thinking that having him around wasn't so bad. I liked useful people. Raul's wife Gemma and their 2 kids, 8-year-old Nico and 6-year-old Tala, arrived in month 6. Gemma had been living with her own family in Mindanao since Raul came to Iloilo, and now that it looked like Raul's stay was extending, it didn't make sense for them to be separated any longer. Salvina explained this over dinner one evening, in a tone that suggested it was already decided. I said, "Where are they going to sleep?" And Salvina said Nico and Tala could share the room with Raul and Gemma for now, just while Raul found work. We now had 7 people in a 3-bedroom house. I want to tell you that I sat Salvina down and had a clear and direct conversation about limits at this point. I want to tell you that what I actually did was say, "This is getting crowded," and Salvina said, "I know, baby, I know, but they're family," with a specific expression. I'll describe it accurately. A softening of the eyes, combined with a slight downward turn at the corners of the mouth, that communicated, without words, that the next thing I said would reveal my character as either a generous man or a selfish one. And I had not spent 32 years managing factory workers without understanding that some conversations are already over before they're finished. I said, "Okay, but we need more space." We expanded the house. I paid a contractor $12,000 to add a room and a bathroom off the back. This was presented and accepted by everyone as a practical solution and a generous act. Nina said a prayer over the new room when it was finished. I stood in the doorway and nodded, and told myself this was good, this was family, this is what people with means do when their family needs help. The cousin arrived in month 8. Her name was Dolly, and she was Gemma's cousin rather than Salvina's, which made her connection to me essentially theoretical. But she arrived with a bag and a warm smile, and was immediately absorbed into the household operation as if she'd always been there. Salvina said Dolly was helping with the cooking and the children, which was true. She was helpful and competent, and the kids liked her. And I thought, well, with 7 people in the house, a little domestic help made sense. Dolly's boyfriend, a young man named June who worked at a loading dock, started appearing at dinner in month 9, and had moved his things into Dolly's room by month 10. I had a conversation with Salvina after I noticed June's motorbike permanently parked in the carport. I said, "Salvina, who authorized June to move in?" She said he was just helping Dolly and wasn't really staying, just sometimes. I said it looked like staying to me. She said I was being too rigid about what staying meant. I said I was being completely clear about what staying meant. She said I was making Dolly feel unwelcome. I said I hadn't known Dolly existed 4 months ago. That was our first real argument. It ended with Salvina crying quietly in the kitchen and me feeling like I had done something wrong, which I examined that night and decided was not an accurate accounting of events, but could not quite shake. We reconciled the following morning. June stayed. 2 teenagers appeared in month 11. Their names were Mark and Cheryl, and they were children of a cousin on Nena's side from the province who had died earlier that year. They needed somewhere to stay while they finished their schooling. Salvina told me this one Sunday morning over breakfast with the matter-of-fact quality of someone announcing a weather forecast. I said, "Salvina, we need to talk about this seriously." She said, "They are orphans, Phillip." I said, "I understand that, and I'm not without sympathy, but this is a household, not a shelter, and I need to be part of these decisions." She said, "You are part of it. I'm telling you now." I said, "Telling me isn't the same as deciding together." She looked at me with that same expression, the eyes, the corners of the mouth, and said, "What do you want me to do? Send them to the street?" Mark and Cheryl moved into the new room we'd added off the back. Dolly and June moved into what had been Dolly's room alone. Raul and Gemma and the kids took the 3rd bedroom. Nina was in the 2nd bedroom. Salvina and I had our room. I had paid for a 2nd expansion, another $9,000, another room and bathroom on the opposite side of the garden, and still the house felt like a bus terminal at midday. 14 people. I counted them one morning at breakfast in a moment that I can only describe as suddenly seeing what I'd been looking at for 2 years. 14 people eating eggs and rice and drinking coffee that I had purchased. The grocery bill had reached $800 a month. I was paying the electricity, the water, Nico and Tala's school fees, Mark and Cheryl's school fees, Lovely's nursing school tuition in Bacolod, Nana's medical appointments, and a standing monthly amount I gave Salvina for household expenses that had grown from $400 to $900 to $1,400 over 18 months, through a process so gradual I hadn't noticed it accelerating. My pension was $2,400 a month. My Social Security was $1,800. My savings were being drawn on at a rate that, when I finally put it into a spreadsheet on a rainy afternoon, while Salvina was at the market, showed me that I had spent $127,000 in 2.5 years, at an average monthly outflow of $4,200, against a total income of $4,200, which meant my savings had been funding the gap for every month my expenses ran over income, which was every month. I sat with that spreadsheet for a long time. I called Derek that night. He was in Columbus, 32 years old, working in logistics, careful with money in the way that children of divorced parents sometimes are. He'd visited Iloilo once, 6 months after the wedding, and had been polite and present, and had said, on the drive from the airport after he flew home, "Dad, it's a lot of people." I'd said I knew. He'd said, "Just keep track of what you're spending." I'd said I would. I told him the number. The $127,000 in 2.5 years. There was a silence on the line. Then he said, "Dad, just that. Just my name," in a tone that carried everything he was choosing not to say. I said, "I know." He said, "What's your plan?" I said I was working on one. He said, "Do you need me to come over?" I said, "Not yet." He said, "Call me more often." I said I would, and meant it. I started tracking everything from that point. Every peso, every purchase, every school fee and medical bill and market run. I put it in the spreadsheet, and I looked at it every Sunday morning the way I used to review production numbers at the plant. Not to make myself feel bad, but to understand the actual situation, rather than the one I'd been telling myself I was in. The actual situation was this. My monthly outflow was $3,900 and climbing. My pension and Social Security totaled $4,200, and I had $213,000 remaining in savings that was being drawn on for any month. The household expenses exceeded my income, which was most months. At the current rate of draw, I calculated, I had approximately 9 years of savings remaining. I was 63. 9 years took me to 72, at which point I would have no buffer and a fixed income and a household that had given me no evidence it would shrink. I talked to Salvina. A real conversation. At the kitchen table. In the morning before the house woke up. I showed her the spreadsheet. I walked her through the numbers slowly and clearly, the way I had walked line supervisors through production data. Not to blame, but to inform. I said that I loved her, and I was committed to our marriage, and that the household as it currently existed was not financially sustainable for us, and that we needed to make some changes together. She looked at the spreadsheet for a while. Then she said, "You're saying my family is a burden." I said, "I'm saying we can't afford to maintain 14 people indefinitely on my retirement savings." She said, "They have nowhere to go." I said, "Raul has been here almost 2 years. Has he found work?" She said he was looking. I said, "What is he looking for exactly?" She said I was being cruel. I said, "I'm being accurate. There's a difference." She stood up from the table and went to start breakfast, and the conversation was over. I sat there with my spreadsheet and my coffee and understood that I had presented facts to someone who was not operating in the same framework as me, and that the gap between those frameworks was bigger than I had wanted to admit. Things changed after that conversation, but not in the direction I'd intended. Salvina became quieter with me. Not cold, not hostile, quiet. The particular quiet of someone who has registered a threat and is recalibrating. The household continued exactly as before. Raul didn't find work. Nana stayed. Mark and Cheryl started their second school year. The grocery bills held. What changed was the smaller things. The coffee on the porch in the morning stopped being a daily habit and became an occasional one. Salvina started spending more evenings in the main room with her family and less time in our room with me. This was subtle enough that I couldn't confront it directly without sounding paranoid, but significant enough that I felt it every day. I raised the financial conversation again in month 32, more specifically this time. I said I needed Raul and Gemma to find their own place within 6 months. I said I would help with first month's rent to get them started. I said this was not a rejection of them as people, but a necessary adjustment for our household's sustainability. I said it calmly and clearly, and with what I believed was genuine generosity given the circumstances. Salvina cried. Not the quiet kitchen crying from before. Real, full crying. At the dinner table, in front of everyone, which meant that by the following morning every adult in the house had an understanding of what I had proposed. The temperature in the compound dropped noticeably. Gemma stopped saying good morning to me. Nina prayed louder and longer than usual. June found somewhere else to be when I walked through the main room. Raul and Gemma did not move out. The motorcycle request came in month 38. Raul and Gemma did not move out. Salvina explained, because there was a delivery job he could get, but it required his own vehicle. $1,400 for a Honda Click. It would pay for itself within 3 months. I had heard versions of this construction before. I had paid $12,000 for a room that was meant to be temporary. I had paid $9,000 for a second room, for orphaned teenagers I hadn't known existed until they needed housing. I had paid $1,200 for Lovely's nursing school application fees, $3,400 for Nena's hip x-rays and follow-up consultations, $800 for Nico's school uniform and textbooks across 2 years, $600 for Tala's, $2,200 for Mark and Cheryl's combined school fees across 2 years. I had paid a grocery bill that had not been below $700 in 3 years. I had, by the count I'd been keeping since the spreadsheet conversation, transferred a total of $180,000 of my retirement savings into this household in 5 years. I said no to the motorcycle. Not angrily, not with a speech. I just said, "No, Salvina. Not this time." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Okay," and left the room. The following week had the quality of weather changing before a storm. Nothing explicit, small things. Salvina cooking dinner for the household, but not calling me when it was ready, so I came out to find everyone already eating. Nena, not meeting my eye in the hallway. Raul and June having conversations that stopped when I walked into the carport. I told myself I was imagining it. I checked the next morning and discovered I was not imagining it. The explicit thing happened on a Thursday. I came into the kitchen at 7 in the morning, and Gemma was at the stove, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as settled. Not hostile, not guilty, but settled, like someone who has arrived at a conclusion. And she said, in English that was clearer than she usually bothered with for my benefit, "You know, sir, in Filipino family, the man provides. That is his role. If he cannot provide, people wonder why he is there." I said, "Excuse me?" She turned back to the stove and said nothing further. I stood in that kitchen for a moment. Then I went back to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and understood something that I had been circling for 5 years without landing on. I was not the head of this household. I had never been the head of this household. I was the funding mechanism, the external resource that the household had organized itself around, efficiently and without malice, the way a plant organizes its growth around available light. Nobody had deceived me in any theatrical sense. Nobody had made promises they hadn't kept, or told me lies I could identify and confront. What had happened was slower and more structural than that. I had been absorbed. I called Derek that afternoon while Salvina was at the market. I told him what Gemma had said. I told him the total. $180,000 in 5 years. I told him about the motorcycle and the week that followed. I told him that I had been sitting on the edge of a bed in a house I had paid for and expanded twice, and that it did not feel like my home in any meaningful sense. He said, "Dad, what do you need?" I said, "I think I need to come home." There was a pause, and then he said, "Okay, when?" I said, "I need to figure out what I'm doing about Salvina first." He said, "I'll fly over." I said, "Derek, you don't have to." He said, "I'll fly over." He came 3 weeks later, 32 years old, 6 feet tall, with my ex-wife Carol's eyes and my jaw, wearing a jacket that was too warm for the Iloilo weather, and carrying a rolling suitcase that he'd clearly packed in a hurry. I picked him up at the airport, and when I saw him walking through the arrival doors, I had to look away for a second, because I hadn't realized how much I'd missed him being physically in the same place as me. He stayed at a hotel near the city. He came to the compound each day, met everyone, ate dinner with the household twice, watched everything with the careful attention of a man trained to notice inefficiencies. On his third evening, he and I sat on the porch after everyone else had gone in, and he said, "Dad, they're nice people, but this isn't a marriage. This is a support structure." I said, "I know." He said, "Does Salvina want to come to the US?" I said I didn't know. I said I hadn't asked her in a long time. He said, "Ask her." I asked her the following evening. We were on the porch alone after dinner, and I said, "Salvina, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Do you want to live in America with me? Do you want to build a life that's ours? Just ours?" She was quiet for a while. The neighborhood sounds came and went. A dog, a tricycle somewhere, the television from Raul and Gemma's room. Then she said, "My family is here." I said, "I know, but I'm asking about us." She said, "You are asking me to choose." I said, "I'm asking what you want." She looked at the garden for a long time, and then she said, "I want my family to be okay." That was the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. I believe that completely. In that sentence was everything. All 5 years of it, all 14 people, all $180,000. She wanted her family to be okay, and she had found a way to make that happen, and she had married a man who had made it possible, and she had done her best to be a genuine wife within those constraints. She had not been cold to me. She had not been cruel. She had simply had a priority that superseded me, and that priority had been visible the whole time if I'd been willing to look at it directly. I said, "I know." She said, "Are you leaving?" I said, "I think I have to." She didn't cry. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they hear something they've been waiting to hear and aren't sure whether to feel relieved or sad. She said, "Will you help the family before you go?" And I looked at her for a long moment, and then I said, "Salvina, I've spent $180,000 helping the family. I think I've done my part." She said, "Okay," and went inside. Derek helped me work through the legal and financial steps of separating my life from the compound I'd built. It took 3 months. The house lease was in both our names, and I removed my name from it. I stopped the automatic transfers. I hired a Philippine attorney who handled the separation process and filed the necessary paperwork. Salvina cooperated without drama. Whatever else she was not vindictive, and the process was as clean as something that complicated can be. I flew home to Cleveland in November. Derek picked me up from Hopkins Airport at 11 at night in a driving rain, which is about as Cleveland a homecoming as you can have. We drove to his apartment in Columbus. He'd insisted I stay with him for a while, not the lake apartment I'd kept on a long-term sublease. And I slept for 11 hours in his spare room and woke up to the smell of coffee and American winter and the sound of my son moving around a kitchen. I've been in Cleveland for 8 months now. The lake apartment is back in my possession, and I've done some things to make it feel like mine again, rather than a waiting room. New furniture, a proper kitchen setup, a coffee maker that works, and that I use every morning. Derek visits once a month, and we watch football and cook something on Sunday afternoons, and I'm slowly relearning what a life built to my own proportions feels like. My retirement account sits at $152,000. Not nothing, but different from the $340,000 I'd started with. I have my pension and my Social Security, and I've worked out a budget that lives within those and touches the savings as rarely as possible. a financial counselor, a practical woman named Rita, who my ex-wife Carol, of all people, recommended, has helped me build a plan for the years ahead that is careful and realistic and does not include a 14-person household. Carol and I have had more conversations in the past 8 months than we'd had in the preceding 6 years combined. Not romantic, that's not what either of us wants and we both know it, but something more honest than what we'd managed when we were married. She said to me once, on the phone, "You always needed to be needed, Philip." That's not a criticism, it just explains some things. I thought about that for a long time. I think she's right. I think a man who spent 32 years responsible for a production floor and then retired into solitude was a man with nowhere to put a significant part of himself, and when someone offered him a household that needed him, he walked into it without counting what it was going to cost. That's not Salvina's fault. Not entirely. She didn't invent the need. She just recognized it before I did. I spoke to Derek about this recently, trying to articulate what I'd actually lost beyond the money. He said, "You lost 5 years, Dad, but you were going to spend those 5 years somewhere. At least you spent them somewhere warm." I laughed at that, and then I thought about it more seriously, and I think he was partly right. The 5 years weren't wasted. I learned things about myself that the factory and the lake apartment wouldn't have taught me. I learned where my edges are. I learned that generosity without structure is just spending. I learned that belonging has to be mutual, or it isn't belonging, it's just proximity. I learned that a household of 14 people can be entirely silent about what's happening and still be completely clear about it, if you're paying attention. I don't feel sorry for myself. That's not what this is. I feel, and I've been trying to find the accurate word for a while, I feel clarified. Like I went somewhere, saw something, gave more than I should have, and came back knowing things I wouldn't know otherwise. The cost was real. The knowledge is also real. I'm not sure how to balance those two things on a spreadsheet, and I'm not sure you can. What I know is that the coffee I make every morning in my own kitchen is mine. The chair I sit in is mine. The view of the lake, which I look at now, which I actually look at, is mine. Nobody is going to knock on the door this morning with a problem that requires my savings account. Nobody's tuition is due. Nobody's medical appointment needs covering. Nobody's nephew's cousin's boyfriend needs somewhere to sleep. This morning it's just me and the lake, and a cup of coffee, and a life that fits the man living it. That's not nothing. At 66, after everything, that turns out to be quite a lot.